Hey, I'm Mierzwinski, an artist and illustrator living in Phoenix, Arizona. My work has been on greeting cards, planners, fabric, magazine spreads, you name it. I also have a whole suite of classes available on Skillshare, because making art just isn't as fun without helping others find their creativity at the same time. In this retreat lesson, we're going to paint a subject from reference, in this case, this little orange, and render it in a bold and expressive style. Here are the materials you'll need to follow along. A full list, as well as the reference photo and summary steps, can be found here. First up is paint. I'll be using Holbein Acryla gouache, a flat, matte, and opaque paint that cures all the way after drying. I'll be using 5 colors: ivory white, pale peach, scarlet, ultramarine, and misty blue. I'll also be mixing a 6th darker color by mixing the ultramarine and scarlet. We need a surface to paint on. I'll be using Canson XL watercolor paper cut down to a smaller size. We'll need some brushes. Any you have on hand will do. I'll be using a variety of round brushes and a flat 1/4 inch brush. You'll need a surface to mix your paint on. I'll be using an old plate dedicated for painting, a vessel of water to mix the paint and to rinse your brush, a paper towel or dedicated kitchen towel for managing water on your brush, and painter's tape to tape off the edge of your paper and to hold your work in place. For mixing larger amounts of color or finer tuned paint mixes, I recommend using a small palette knife, though it won't be necessary for me to use in this particular demo. To prepare, gather your materials and tape off your paper. The first thing I like to do when assessing any project that I'm about to paint is figuring out if I'm going to sketch first. And in this case, I could probably freehand it without sketching the orange first, but I want to show you the full process. And so in this case, I will sketch. However, the next thing is I know that I'm going to paint the background of this. I'm going to cover this background in ivory white. And so I'm not going to spend the time sketching right now only to cover it with the ivory. Even though there's a good chance the pencil or paint lines would show through the ivory enough to guide me. It's just I like to sketch on top of my background layer, and I also don't mind when some of my sketch lines show through. And since my background color isn't a mixed color and is just coming right from the tube, I can be careful to only squeeze out a little bit and not too much, and I can squeeze out more if I need it. So I'm just going to grab a number 4 round brush. I'm using this one because it's this one in particular is a natural hair brush, so it really seems to mop up a lot of water and spread a lot of paint around, and that's what I want when doing the background. And since this is such a light color, I'm going to make a thinner wash to go on top of the background because it won't take much to just tint the background from white to ivory. And that will also help on dry time. If I use a really thick layer of paint, I'm just going to be sitting here waiting a long time before I can paint on top of it. I try not to be too perfect when painting my backgrounds. I like there to be some brush movement. Though, again, since ivory is so light, it's possible we won't be able to see many of those variations. So now I'm just going to wait for my paint to dry. So now that my background layer has dried, I'm ready to just do some really basic sketching just to help me make sure that I get the placement of my orange where I want it. Now you can sketch with pencil, colored pencil, or with your paint. I'm going to use the light pink that I'll be using for my orange color because it's the one that will be the least competitive with the rest of the paint I'm going to put on top of it. Since my orange is going to be this light pink color, if I were to use red or blue, for instance, for the sketching, I would have to do a lot of covering up and a lot of layers in order to cover that blue. Whereas if I just paint and sketch in the light pink, it'll be easier for me to cover that up. It may be hard for you to see on screen, but that's okay because I'm really just doing a most basic drawing here. I'm going to just start with the shape of the orange. And it's really light. I can just barely make it out with my eyes in person, but it's enough for me to go off of. And then I've got that leaf that's gonna come over here. Stem kind of comes out from the center, but then leans over to the left. And so I can see that I at least can, I just have a guide. Like I didn't even draw out the whole leaf. I just basically drew the arc of where it's going to go. And now when I get painting, I don't have to worry about, you know, it being too off center or anything. And so with that, since it's so simple, I can just go right into painting my orange. And so when I'm trying to think of what color to paint something, I know that at any point I'm going to add shadows and highlights to it. So I try to think of, you know, what is the base color that I want this item to be? And in this case, I just want my orange to be this nice, sweet little pink color. Now I'm seeing that there's not a ton of contrast here between the shell pink and the ivory like I was hoping. And so I'm just going to darken the pink a tiny bit by adding a little bit of my scarlet, since pink is just white and red mixed together. And the scarlet is very strong, so it probably won't take much. I really don't want to go too dark. I just want there to be just enough contrast. Maybe I'll add some of my ivory back in. Yeah. And this paint is a little bit thick, which is okay. I'm just trying to be mindful of drying times. And I don't know if you can see it, but I got a little ledge of paint because it was so thick. And so I just want to go over that with a smaller brush. And I'm going to let that dry. And while I do, I'm going to start painting the stem. Now I'll need to be careful because my paint, like I said, is really thick and still wet through here. And so if I glide over that with this dark blue color, it's essentially just going to mix right on the page. And I don't want that. I want these to have like really nice, clean, flat shapes. But I can still start with the stem up here and start working on the leaf over here while the paint dries. And for this, I am picking up my size 4 soft round brush again, because I feel pretty confident that I'll be able to hang out on the tip of this and keep it light as I want. If you have a less gentle touch and you're a little heavier handed, you might want a stiffer brush like one of Peggy's Pigeon Letters rounds, like a size 6. This is a size 10, but her size 6 is like a go-to, and that has a lot better snap than this guy does. But like I said, I feel good about my ability to kind of stay on the tip where I need it to be thin. And I'll like the variation that the brush will bring with it. When I'm mixing my paint with the water, I'm looking for a consistency of like heavy cream. That seems to be where the best like mix of it being fluid and opaque is. And so what I want to do here with the stem is I want to be thoughtful in the fact that I don't want to have this big, awkward, clunky stem coming out of it. I want it to have that kind of natural and effortless look, but at the same time, I want to make sure that it makes sense. And so all of that is to say is I'm going to be thoughtful about where I put my brush down, and I'm going to be really thinking about what the goal is, which the goal is to create a natural looking stem that starts in the center of the orange and starts to fade over to the side. But I want the natural expression of the brush to kind of do the work. So I'm going to try and hold back and not correct myself too much. Once the brush touches down, I'm going to kind of let it do its thing. So I really want to start here because this is where I would naturally start. I'm a little worried about that pink, but I'm going to be really gentle on top just to make my first touchdown. And that didn't mix so bad. And now I'm going to loosen up. I'm going to move my hand further down the brush, and I'm just going to really let the brush do its thing with figuring out where this stem is going to go. And so this little shake in my hand, the little blob of the brush, that's the magic that I'm looking for. That's the expression that I want the brush to do. Now I am going to switch over. I can't get a great tip for the tip of the leaf here, so I am going to switch over to that number 6 pigeon letters round. It's a little bit more stiff. And get in there, and I'm going to work on the leaf next. And the leaf I'm not going to do in one perfect pull. You're more than welcome to, but this is where I want kind of the expression of the leaf to be there. And so I'm less worried of making one perfect shape and more looking at the reference photo and seeing the characteristics of the leaf and letting my brush express that. So I see a leaf that isn't perfectly straight. It looks like the edges are ruffled just a little bit. It also looks like it's got this nice bend in it. And so I'm just going to go ahead and confidently just like push down with my brush and let my brush go in there and start making those strokes. And you can see I'm not making that shape with one perfect stroke. I did it with multiple. I lifted my brush a few times. And now I feel really good. I really like that natural shape that was created. Just going to add a little stem there and complete this a little bit better. Cute. So now we at least have the base shapes down. We know what's going to be in this painting, but now I want to start making it more interesting by adding in some shadows and some highlights. So the first thing is I want to add a shadow to my little orange here. And I'm going to use my red color for that because my red is at least darker than the pink, which is the color of that orange. And so it may not be able to be the shadow for the leaf color, but it's dark enough to be the shadow for the orange color. And looking at the reference photo, I can see the light is kind of hitting our little orange or little clementine right here. And so it's this side and underneath that I'm going to want to use my red on. And actually, I want to switch brushes. I know I just loaded up that brush, but I actually want to use a flat wash brush for this. And the reason is I really like the geometric shape of the brush. I just can't get that with a round brush, obviously. And so I'm gonna go in here, and now I might need more paint. I may have wasted a little bit by loading up that brush. I don't need much. But I'm just gonna go in, and again, I'm going to be thoughtful. I'm not gonna let my hand get possessed and just go all over the place. But at the same time, I do want my brush to do what it's going to do and be a little bit unpredictable. So again, I'm not gonna do one perfect stroke. I'm lifting up my brush and kind of bringing it back down. And that's gonna let some of the character of the brush shine through. And my pink paint was still a little bit wet in here, so I'm trying to just be mindful of not going over some of those areas. But I'm really almost done here anyway. I don't wanna overdo it. And I may have overdone it. But that's the fun. We're gonna keep going with it and see how it turns out. Now it just kind of looks like everything's sort of floating on here, and so I do want to add a shadow between the ground and the figure, which in this case is our orange. And I'm gonna start by using the blue. That's just what my gut's saying. I think if I use the red and go down here, it's just going to make it look, it's going to ruin the shape that we created there. And I think it will be detached enough from the leaf that it won't muddle that. So I'm just gonna get in here. And again, I'm going to let my brush touching down kind of do its job of what the shape is going to look like. Awesome. So this is a good few steps, but I really like to just kind of pow it home contrast-wise. And so after I let this paint dry, I'm going to go in with my darkest value, which in this case is going to be a mix of scarlet and ultramarine. It's going to make like a neutrally brownish red. And I'm going to go in and further define these shapes to help separate them more, as well as add some texture. But we need to let these dry before that can happen. So my paint from these layers is just about dry. If you look at your painting from the side where the light is hitting, you'll be able to see areas of reflection, and that means your paint is still wet. I still have one stubborn little spot right here that hasn't dried all the way, but that's not going to impede where I'll be painting, and so I'm going to move forward. The next part I want to do, like I talked about, is adding in my darkest value. So I'm going to mix red, this warm red and this warm blue, because they're basically opposites on the color wheel at this point because this red is so warm. That I'm not really fearing making a purple, or the purple I will make will be so neutralized that it's not going to stand out as purple. It's just going to be a nice dark neutral for me to paint with. And for this, I want to use a smaller brush. I could still use my flat edge brush to keep getting those nice geometric lines, but in this case, I really don't want to overdo the dark color. I want it to just help sharpen some of the areas and add just one more layer of contrast. So I'm either going to use, I think I'll probably use this round brush, this size 2 Princeton round, but I also will sometimes use this angled brush. This is a 3mm, 1/8 of an inch Winsor Newton Cotman angled brush. But I think I'm just going to stick with the round. It's already in my hand and it feels right. And I'm just going to go ahead and mix my red and blue together until I get that sort of deep reddish brown purple neutral that I'm looking for. And like I said, I want to be thoughtful about where I'm pressing my brush down, but then once the brush is down, I want it to be able to do its own thing. So the main spot where this darkest color is going to be is separating the orange itself from the background. So my goal when I set the brush down is to create a dark value of separation here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm really loading up my brush because I know this brush, the bristles are so short it can't hold that much. And so I'm just going to go ahead and go for it. And then the next spot I see is there's kind of a back shadow. I just got a little bit getting too excited. Still need to make sure my paint mix is working. So a little bit thicker than heavy cream at this point because I want it to really have some staying power. But up here, so I'm just gonna let my brush touch down there. And then on this leaf, there's some areas. I'm going to loosen up on the brush again so that I can really kind of let it do its thing. And I don't want to touch down too many times, just a few times to add a nice little contrast in there. And then my last bit will be up here, and then a touch on the stem too. And then right now, someone looking at this could theoretically not really know if it's an orange or an apple or a peach or some other fruit. And so the other characteristic that I see in my reference photo that I want to bring forward are those little tiny dots, those little divots that make up the skin of the orange. And instead of painting them one by one, which actually could be a cool coverage, so if you covered this entire area in like a nice, almost neat, tiny dot pattern, that could give a nice, really graphic look. But I want to go for something a little bit more expressive and less planned. And so I'm going to do a little bit of dark spatter. Now the risk of me doing spatter over this area is it's not going to stay contained to just the orange. It can absolutely fly out anywhere, especially since I'm not using any type of masking. It would be easy enough to cover up with a piece of paper, but I actually like the unpredictability of the spatter. I want the energy of it and the little burst of the dots. And so for me, it's not actually important that it stays only on this orange area. It's more of an idea just to give that texture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my soft round brush for this that I was using earlier, and I'm going to load it up with water and this dark paint. And it's okay if the paint mix now is a little bit more watery than it was before. We're going to want it to be fluid in order for it to speckle. And I'm just going to go ahead and use the handle of another brush as a base, and I'm going to tap against it so that the spatter comes off of the brush and onto the paper. That's all I need. And so I really want to make sure that I let all of these little dots dry because they're mostly water, and so it's going to take a while for them to dry and flatten out. But then once that's dry, I'm going to add one more final piece to this touch before calling it done. At this point, you could absolutely call your painting done. We have this really nice subject matter. It's weighted down by its shadow down here. It's got some energy with its little spatter. It could be done. However, since I did create essentially a ground here by painting in this shadow, I think it would add interest and really help complete the painting to add some type of wallpaper or some type of design to the wall behind the orange. And so I'm going to use this misty blue color to create some type of wallpaper design. I love stripes. It's really hard for me to not do stripes. I love them so much. But you could easily do a floral pattern. You could get out a tiny brush and do a really nice intricate design back here. You could do dots. It can be anything you want. You could even just paint in another color, even coming in here with the misty blue and maybe painting this 2/3 or 3/4 of the up here would be enough. But I think I'm going to do the stripes. So I'm going to take my misty blue and squeeze some out. And I'm going to use the thickness of my flat brush again. So this is a quarter inch wide brush, and I think I really like the scale of those stripes for this. If I had been planning ahead, I could have done the stripes before doing the spatter. That way these little spatter marks would be on top. However, if I paint over one of these two and I'm bummed that I'm missing, or it looks weird that you can kind of see them through the paint, I can always repaint it on top. So normally I might rotate my paper because it's easier for me to go from right to left when doing my stripes. However, everything's all framed up nicely for the camera, and so I'm going to pull up. But I am going to use my knuckle, my pinky knuckle, to act as an anchor for me to drag across to try and help steady it. But here's the thing. I want to try and keep the same attitude throughout the entirety of making the stripes. So for instance, if I lay my first one down and it's a little bit crooked, then guess what? The rest of them are going to be a little bit crooked too, and maybe they'll all be a little bit different. Or if I lay the first one down and it's like pretty perfect and kind of solid and straight, I'm going to want to try and do pretty perfect and solid and straight all the way across. The main thing here is that you don't want any big outlier. So if you have a few crooked ones, then going in and doing a perfectly straight one is going to make it look wrong. Whereas if you just embrace how it comes out, then it just looks like an expressive decision. So I'm going to be thoughtful, but I'm going to let my brush do the thing and dictate what this is going to look like. I'm just going to have them go down, you know, rule of thirds, kind of down to the third here, acting like that's where the end of that table is. So I was able to keep a pretty even amount of force. It is a little bit wobbly, so I'm not going to try and be too perfect on the next one. And I'm going to come close to my painting here, but not all the way. Because if I try to get in there with this brush, I'm just going to make a mistake. And so I did go over that spatter, but it doesn't really matter that much, so I probably won't need to paint over it. So I can see these three have set the tone for the rest of them. They're a little bit imperfect, and so, but they are confident. And so I want all of them to be a little bit imperfect, but confident. Now this is one of those ones where I might have the urge to try and straighten it out, but then that's gonna make this one thicker than all the other ones. And so you just gotta trust yourself. Trust what you've laid down. So now all I'm going to do is use a smaller brush, probably a round brush, to complete the stripes and bring them down closer to where they belong. And this can be a little tricky, but just take the time and go slow. Take your time and go slow. Another option would have been to plan ahead and paint the stripes before painting all the other stuff, but I like doing it this way. I like making decisions as I go and figuring out creative ways to make it work. I got a little bit light on where it's supposed to be blue, but I can go in there and correct it with the ultramarine after if it stands out. Great. And with that, we have a really sweet little painting. We were able to take a pretty basic reference photo and turn it into an artistic rendering that's interesting, that's stylized, and pretty removed from the reference photo itself. I hope you'll take these techniques of using a base color and then layering on interesting colors for shadows and highlights will help you. If I wanted to add a highlight here, I could bring that ivory back and just do a quick smudge on there. But for me, I think the difference between the pink and the red is enough to create that form, and I don't need that third layer of highlight. But what I was saying is you can apply this to any subject you're looking at. If you're looking at a landscape, you can figure out the base color for the main hill, and then maybe there's some trees that you figure out a different color for, and then they'll have their own shadows and their own highlights. And you can take it one step at a time to create a picture that's really interesting. Thank you so much for hanging out with me during Summer Creative Retreat. If you want to catch a replay of this, there will be links flying around all over the place, I'm sure. And if you'd like to keep in touch with me, you can hear about my newest published classes by following me on Skillshare. You can keep up with all my product collabs and latest tips and tricks by signing up for my quarterly newsletter at bydylanm.com. And if you want more casual and regular encouragement, find me on Instagram at bydylanm. Happy painting!